The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic chant, a song of rust and ruin sung under the relentless August sun. It was the summer of '73, and Tom Miller's farm was being sold off, piece by painful piece. I stood near the back, my arms crossed over my chest, the brim of my seed corn cap pulled low. I wasn't here to vulture, not really. I was here to pay my respects and, if the price was right, to give a good piece of steel a new home. Tom had been a good neighbor. He'd followed the advice from the magazines and the university extension office, got bigger, took out loans, bought a brand new International Harvester 1066 with a white cab and air conditioning. It sat there now, gleaming red under the sun, the star of the show, but with a bank lien thick as a log chain wrapped around its axle. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill, was working his way through the smaller items: wrenches in greasy coffee cans, log chains in tangled piles, a Lincoln arc welder that had seen better days. I watched, listening to the bids, feeling the pulse of the crowd. These were my people, farmers with dirt under their nails and worry etched into the corners of their eyes. They bid in small, cautious increments, knowing the value of a dollar earned through sweat and prayer. Then they rolled it out. A Brilliant cultipacker, the heavy, cast-iron kind. 24 feet wide, with the solid packer wheels that could turn clods into a seedbed as fine as garden soil. It was old, the paint long faded to a dull, sun-bleached orange, but the bones were good. I'd seen it work Tom's ground for 15 years. The bearings were tight, and there wasn't a crack in the frame. That was the kind of iron my father had taught me to trust. "All right, boys, what do we bid for this fine piece of tillage equipment?" Bill the auctioneer chirped, his voice crackling through the cheap PA system. "Who'll start me at $500? 500? Do I hear 5? Silence. 500 was steep for a piece that old. 300 then. 300, a working man's price. A farmer to my left, a man named Henderson, raised a finger. 300, Bill acknowledged. 3 1/4, another voice called out. I waited, let them chew on it. I'd already walked the machine over, kicked the wheels, put a hand on the main frame to feel for stress fractures. It was sound. I knew what I was willing to pay, down to the last dollar. My limit was 700, cash money, folded neat in the front pocket of my jeans. The bidding stalled at 450. I saw Bill's eyes scan the crowd, looking for a fresh face. I gave a slight nod. 500, I got 500 from the man in the back, Bill shouted, pointing in my direction. Now 5 1/4, who'll give me 5 1/4? Henderson shook his head and stepped back. The other bidder was out. It looked like it was mine. Sold, for $500 to Jedediah Stone. I let out a slow breath. A good price for a good tool. As I started to walk toward the auctioneer's trailer to settle up, a cloud of dust billowed up the lane. A brand new Ford F-250, shiny black with chrome everywhere, crunched to a stop. The door opened and out stepped Richard Davies. Rich wasn't from around here, not really. He'd bought the old Peterson place 5 years back with money from his father's construction business back east. He farmed with a checkbook, not a wrench. He walked through the crowd like he owned it, wearing clean boots and a shirt without a single sweat stain. He saw me and a smirk played on his lips. "Still collecting relics, Jed?" he asked, his voice loud enough for a few others to hear. I just nodded. "Afternoon, Rich. 500 for that old roller?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, for a little more, the dealer could set you up with a new one. Probably get you financed at 7%. "This one's already built," I said, keeping my voice even. "Don't need a loan for something that's already been paid for." His smirk widened. "That's the problem with you old-timers. You're scared of debt. You can't make money if you don't use the bank's money. It's called leverage." A few of the younger farmers nearby nodded in agreement. They looked at Rich's new truck, at the new equipment he bought every year, and they saw success. They looked at my 10-year-old Chevy, at the faded paint on my John Deere 4020, and they saw a man being left behind. I didn't say anything else. I walked to the trailer, pulled the worn leather wallet from my pocket, and counted out 5 $100 bills. The woman inside gave me a receipt. Paid in full. No interest, no monthly payments, no banker owning a piece of my labor. As I walked back to my truck, I heard the bidding start on Tom Miller's 1066. Rich Davies opened the bidding at $20,000, a number that made a few men gasp. He was going to buy it, run it for a season, and then trade it in on next year's model. That was his way. I got in my truck and drove home, the dust of the auction settling behind me. I didn't feel superior, just different. My father, a man who survived the 30s, had burned a single lesson into my soul. The bank is a fair-weather friend, son. They'll give you an umbrella when the sun is shining and demand it back the minute it starts to rain. I lived by that. Every piece of equipment on my farm, from the old Farmall M I used for mowing ditches to the New Holland baler, was mine. All of it. Except for the big one. I pulled into my own lane and stopped the truck, looking out across the machine shed. Tucked inside, shielded from the sun, sat the beast. My Steiger, a Cougar II, built in 1971. It wasn't new when I bought it 2 years ago. It had come off a big farm up in the Dakotas, a place that had gone under. It had 3,000 hours on it, and the green paint was faded and chipped. But I had spent a whole winter crawling over every inch of that machine. I'd saved for 5 years to buy it, putting away money from every good crop, living lean when others were buying new cars. When the time came, I drove up there with a cashier's check for $35,000. The banker who was handling the liquidation couldn't believe it. "You're not financing any of this?" he'd asked, his jaw slack. I just shook my head. That Steiger was my leverage, not the bank's, mine. It had a 3208 Cat engine, a V8 that rumbled with the kind of deep guttural power that made the ground tremble. It was articulated, bending in the middle like a giant insect, able to put all 4 of its massive tires to the ground for traction that my 4020 could only dream of. With that tractor, I could pull a 7-shank V-ripper through hardpan clay, breaking it up a full 18 inches deep, letting the water and roots go down where they needed to be. It was the one piece of modern power I needed, the one great advantage, and it was paid for. It sat there in the silence of my shed, a giant green monster, owing no man a dime. Rich Davies could have his shiny new red tractors with their radios and air conditioning. I had my Steiger. I had my freedom. At the time, I was sure that was all that mattered. Before we go any further, I want to ask you all something, and I want you to be honest. Who did you know like that back in the day? The fella who paid cash for everything, even if it was old and faded, versus the one who had the newest rig on the lot every spring, courtesy of the local bank. We all knew both kinds. Which one did you think was smarter back then, in the thick of the good times? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm curious to hear your stories. The rest of that summer and into the fall, I worked on that old Brillian cultipacker. It became a project, something to do after chores, under the bare bulb hanging in my workshop. The first thing I did was take it apart. Every single packer wheel came off. I used a 3/4-inch impact wrench, its staccato hammering echoing in the quiet of the night, but some of the nuts were rusted solid. For those, I got out the cutting torch, the hiss and pop of the blue flame, a familiar sound. I'd heat the nut cherry red, then quench it with penetrating oil. The sizzle and the acrid smoke filled the air, a smell of stubborn iron giving way. One by one, I pulled the bearings. They were shot, just as I suspected. I drove the 30 miles to the industrial supply house in Waterloo and bought new Timken bearings, the best money could buy. I didn't haggle. Quality costs, and it pays you back in the long run. Back home, I cleaned the housings with a wire wheel on my bench grinder until they shone, the sparks flying like fireflies in the dim light. I packed the new bearings with high-temperature grease, my fingers working the thick blue stuff into every roller until it oozed out the other side. That was a satisfaction you couldn't get from signing a loan paper. It was the feeling of making something right with your own 2 hands. The frame was next. I went over every weld with a chipping hammer looking for cracks. I found 2 small hairline fractures near the main hinge point. I ground them out with a grinder, the screech of the wheel on steel setting my teeth on edge until I had a clean V-groove. Then I fired up the old Lincoln welder. I laid down a bead, slow and steady, watching the puddle of molten steel, weaving it back and forth, building it up layer by layer until the repair was stronger than the original metal. By the time I was done, winter had set in. The cultipacker was reassembled, every bolt torqued, every grease zerk overflowing. I even gave it a fresh coat of paint, not brilliant orange, but John Deere green to match my 4020. It looked out of place in my shed, a piece of old iron made new again, sitting next to the faded paint of my other equipment. The talk around town didn't stop. It got worse. That winter at the co-op, I'd hear the whispers. Jed Stone spent all fall fixing that piece of junk he bought at the Miller sale. Heard he's still running that old two-cylinder for odd jobs. He's gonna get left in the dust. You gotta spend money to make money. Rich Davies was the new king of the county. He'd had a fantastic harvest with his new 1066. The price of corn was climbing, nudging $2 a bushel, then $2.50. Rich used that projected income to secure another loan and bought another 80 acres that came up for sale. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. He was the man the bankers loved to see walk in the door. I felt the pressure. No man is an island. When your neighbors, the men you've known your whole life, start looking at you like you're a fool, it wears on you. My wife, Martha, was patient, but even she would ask, "Jed, are you sure we're doing the right thing? The Hendersons just got a new station wagon. Mary Beth showed me the pictures." "Our car runs fine, Martha," I'd say, "and it's paid for." "I know, but it just feels like we're falling behind." The true test came that spring, the spring of '74. It was a wet one. The rain came down in sheets, turning the fields into a thick black soup. Every farmer in the county was on edge, waiting for a dry spell to get in and plant. When we finally got a 3-day window, it was a mad dash. I fired up the 4020, its diesel engine barking to life in the cool morning air. I hitched up my planter and went to work. The ground was still heavy, and the tractor worked hard, its tires biting into the damp soil. On the second day, halfway through planting my best 80 acres of bottom ground, it happened. I was making a turn on the headland when I heard a high-pitched whine from the transmission, and the hydraulics went dead. The planter arms, which were lifted for the turn, crashed down into the mud. I knew that sound, the main hydraulic pump. A catastrophic failure. I sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, the silence of the dead hydraulics deafening. A wave of cold dread washed over me. This was it. This was the moment Rich Davies and the others were always talking about. The breakdown of old iron at the worst possible time. My planting window was closing and my main tractor was dead in the water. I spent the rest of that day and all through the night working on it. The pump was buried deep in the tractor's guts. I had to drain 15 gallons of hydraulic fluid, disconnect the lines, and unbolt the whole assembly. My hands were slick with oil. My knuckles were busted and bleeding. At 2 in the morning, under the harsh glare of a single trouble light, I finally got the pump out. The main shaft had sheared clean off. The John Deere dealer was my first call at 7 a.m. sharp. The parts man was sympathetic. "Oh yeah, we can get you a new one, Jed." "Let's see. Looks like it'll have to come out of Moline. Take about 3, maybe 4 days." 4 days? My heart sank. I don't have 4 days. The rain is coming back by the weekend. "Sorry, Jed. Best I can do." I hung up the phone, my mind racing. I was losing the season. Just then, I heard the roar of a big diesel engine coming down the road. I looked out the workshop door and saw Rich Davies driving by, sitting high in the cab of his new International. He was pulling a 24-row planter, twice the size of mine. He saw me standing there, covered in grease, my dead tractor in the field behind me. He gave me a little wave, a slow, knowing smile on his face, and kept on going. In that moment, I felt a kind of despair I hadn't felt in years. He was winning. His philosophy was working, and mine was failing, spectacularly, in a muddy field for all the world to see. The story of the '70s farm boom is one that's been told 1,000 times. It was a gold rush, but with soil instead of rock. After the Russian grain deal in '72, commodity prices didn't just climb, they exploded. Corn went from $1.50 a bushel to $3, then $4. Soybeans hit $12, land values doubled, then tripled. The Secretary of Agriculture himself, Earl Butz, was on the radio telling us to plant fence-row to fence-row. Get big or get out, that was the mantra. And for a few glorious years, it seemed like the music would never stop. For men like Rich Davies, it was a dream come true. Every time the price of corn ticked up a dime, his net worth on paper soared. The bankers saw him as a genius. They threw money at him. He bought another quarter section, the old Johnson place, paying a price per acre that made my father turn over in his grave. He traded in the 1066 and bought a brand new International 1466, and then, the ultimate status symbol, his own brand new Steiger. A Panther III with a roaring Cummins engine and duals all around that looked big enough to float the tractor across a lake. He built new grain bins, a massive machine shed, and a new ranch-style house for his wife with a 2-car garage. He was the embodiment of the new American farmer, a titan of the prairie. And me? I survived the spring of '74. I found a used hydraulic pump at a salvage yard 60 miles away, drove there and bought it for $200 cash. I spent another sleepless night installing it, my body aching, my hands raw. But I got the crop in. I only lost one day. The rains came, just as predicted, and I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching it pour down, feeling an exhaustion so deep it was in my bones. But the seed was in the ground. Throughout those boom years, I farmed my land. I didn't buy any more. My 500 acres were enough. The prices were good, and for the first time in my life, I was making real money. But I didn't act like it. Rich Davies bought a new boat to take to the lake on weekends. I bought a new set of tires for the 4020. He took his family to Florida for a vacation. I put a new steel roof on the barn and paid the contractor in cash. The money I made went into 3 places. First, I prepaid my inputs for the next year. I'd buy my seed, fertilizer, and chemicals in the fall, paying cash when the suppliers were hungry for business. It saved me 10, sometimes 15%. Second, I built up my savings. Not in fancy stocks, but in simple savings accounts and US savings bonds. It was boring, but it was safe. Third, I maintained my equipment. If something needed fixing, I fixed it right. No baling wire, no good enough patches. I replaced worn parts before they could break and cause a bigger problem. My machinery wasn't shiny, but it was ready. To my neighbors, I was a ghost at the feast. They saw me as a stubborn fool, a man so terrified of risk that he was missing the opportunity of a lifetime. The talk at the diner changed from whispers to open pity. Poor Jed, they'd say, shaking their heads, still driving that old Chevy. If he'd just leveraged his land back in '73, he'd be a millionaire by now. Rich Davies never missed a chance to remind me. I saw him at the co-op one afternoon. He pulled up in his new Steiger, the engine rumbling like thunder. He leaned out of the clean, air-conditioned cab. "Jed," he yelled over the noise, "I heard you're still patching that old 4020 together. You ought to let me co-sign a loan for you down at the bank. Get you into a real tractor." He winked at the other men standing around. "It's the modern age, old-timer. You gotta keep up." I just tipped my cap. "She runs good, Rich, and she's all mine." He laughed, a big booming laugh that said he thought I was the biggest fool in Black Hawk County. He gunned the engine of his new tractor, leaving me in a cloud of diesel smoke. I stood there for a moment, the laughter of the other men stinging my ears. Doubt is a powerful weed. It can grow in the most stubborn soil. Was I wrong? Was my father's Depression-era caution just a relic, a useless anchor in this new ocean of prosperity? Every newspaper, every farm journal, every banker and politician was telling me I was a dinosaur. The world had changed. That winter, the winter of '79, I was at the bank to deposit the last of the checks from the harvest. The prices were still high, the yields had been good. It was another profitable year. As I stood in line, I saw the bank president, Mr. Harrison, walking with a farmer I knew, a man named Paul, who farmed the section next to Rich Davies. Paul looked worried. "Now, Paul, don't you fret," Mr. Harrison was saying in a soothing voice, his hand on Paul's shoulder. "These interest rates are a temporary thing. The Fed has to get a handle on inflation, that's all. They'll come back down." "But 12%, Mr. Harrison?" Paul said, his voice trembling slightly. "My operating loan just reset at 12%. How am I supposed to make that pencil out?" "The price of land keeps going up, my boy," Harrison boomed, clapping him on the back. "Your assets are growing every day. We'll just roll that interest into the principal. Don't you worry. This boom is here to stay. The government won't let the American farmer fail." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter wind outside. I looked past them, out the big plate glass window of the bank. A new Lincoln Continental, long and white, pulled into the parking lot. Rich Davies got out. He wasn't wearing farm clothes. He had on a tailored suit. Mr. Harrison's eyes lit up. He quickly excused himself from the worried-looking Paul and practically ran to the door to greet Rich, shaking his hand like he was a visiting king. They walked past me, deep in conversation. I heard Rich say, "Another 300 acres just came up for sale. The price is high, but I think we can make it work if we get creative with the financing." I finished my deposit and walked out into the cold, grey afternoon. The wind was sharp, and it carried the scent of snow. I looked at Rich's fancy car, at the imposing brick bank, at the whole world that seemed to be screaming that I was wrong. But all I could hear was my father's voice, a quiet whisper from the past saying, "They'll give you an umbrella when the sun is shining, and demand it back the minute it starts to rain." And for the first time in a long time, I saw a dark cloud on the horizon, a single ominous thunderhead that no one else seemed to notice. The rain stopped falling. That was how it began, not with a crash, but with a silence. The spring of 1980 had been generous, but as May bled into June, the sky turned a hard, metallic blue. The clouds that scudded across the horizon were thin and wispy, promising nothing. By July, the corn, which should have been shoulder-high and rustling with life, stood stunted and pale green. Its leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate, thirsty prayer to a sky that wasn't listening. The ground cracked, forming deep fissures that looked like jagged wounds in the earth. The air was thick with the smell of hot dust and dying crops. Rich Davies fought the drought with money. He'd had deep wells drilled and bought massive center-pivot irrigation rigs for his flat bottomland. All day and all night, you could hear the chugging of the big diesel engines that ran the pumps, a constant, expensive heartbeat echoing across the parched landscape. His new Steiger Panther III was a beast, pulling a 36-foot field cultivator, trying to create a dust mulch to conserve what little moisture was left. It ran around the clock, with hired men taking shifts, the cab lights glowing like malevolent eyes in the hazy darkness. My own field suffered. The corn on the high ground, the clay knobs, was burning up. There was nothing I could do for it. But in the lower ground, where I had used the old Steiger to pull that V-ripper years before, the roots had gone deep. The plants were stressed, their leaves a shade too light, but they were alive. They had found the subsoil moisture that the shallower tilled fields had lost. I worked my ground sparingly, going out only in the cool of the early morning or late evening to cultivate, keeping the weeds down, trying not to disturb the precious moisture. My old Cougar 2 rumbled along, its Cat V8 running at a steady, low RPM, sipping fuel compared to the screaming Cummins in Rich's new machine. The breaking point came in August. I was out checking fences when I saw it. Rich's Panther, the pride of the county, was sitting dead still in the middle of a field, the giant field cultivator sunk into the powdery dirt behind it. An hour later, the dealer's service truck was there. I saw them again the next day, and the day after that. The talk at the diner was that a computer module in the transmission had fried. It was a sealed unit, a black box that no one knew how to fix. You just replaced it. The part was on back order from the factory in Fargo. The tractor sat for a full week under the brutal sun, a monument of red steel and rubber, useless. The bill for the service calls and the new part, I later heard, was over $4,000, more than I had paid for my entire tractor. 2 days after his Steiger went down, my own developed a problem. A pinhole leak in the radiator. I saw the telltale drip of green coolant on the shop floor after I shut it down for the day. The next morning, I drained the system, pulled the radiator and drove it into town to the old-fashioned radiator shop run by a man named Gus. He found the leak, soldered it up strong, and charged me $40. I had it back in the tractor and was running by lunchtime. The cracks in Rich's empire were beginning to show. He was burning through cash at a furious rate, paying for fuel, for hired help, for massive repair bills. The irrigation was saving some of his crop, but at a tremendous cost. I heard him at the fuel co-op, his voice tight with anger, arguing with the manager over his account. "What do you mean my credit is maxed out?" he'd snapped. My crop is worth a fortune in the field." The manager, a quiet man named Frank, just shook his head. "The bank sets the limit, Rich, not me, and they're getting nervous." That fall, the drought broke with a vengeance. A line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised greenish black. The wind came first, a low moan that built to a freight train roar. Then came the hail. It wasn't small, pea-sized stuff. It was the size of golf balls, then baseballs, driven sideways by the 80-mile-per-hour winds. It lasted for 10 minutes, 10 minutes of pure, roaring destruction. When it was over, the silence was more terrible than the noise. I went outside. The ground was white with ice. My barn had holes in the steel roof, but my crops, what was left of them, were mostly standing. The hail had shredded the leaves, but missed the ears on the stunted stalks. I looked across the road at Rich Davies's fields. The irrigated corn, tall and lush, had been a perfect target. It hadn't just been damaged, it had been annihilated. The stalks were stripped bare, pounded into the mud. What had been a field of green gold just 10 minutes before was now a worthless, shredded ruin. The insurance would cover some of it, but not all, not nearly enough. The music for Rich Davies was beginning to fade. The hailstorm of 1980 was just the overture. The real symphony of destruction began in Washington, D.C. A man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve declared war on inflation, and his only weapon was interest rates. They didn't just climb, they went supernova. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, hit 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. For farmers who were leveraged, it was a death sentence. Operating loans that had been written at 8% were suddenly resetting at 18. That soothing banker, Mr. Harrison, was no longer a friend. He was a man with a gun to his own head, being squeezed by federal regulators, and he was passing that pressure down the line. The game of rolling interest into the principal was over. The bank wanted its money, and it wanted it now. Commodity prices collapsed. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union had slammed the door on a major market. A worldwide recession crippled demand. Corn that had been $4 a bushel was suddenly worth $2. Land that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre was now struggling to find a buyer at $1,500. The paper fortunes that men like Rich Davies had built vanished like smoke. They were trapped. They owed $3,000 an acre money on land that was now worth half that, and they were trying to make payments with $2 corn while paying 20% interest. It was mathematically impossible. The foreclosure notices started appearing in the county paper, small print in the legal section that read like obituaries. First it was Paul, the man I'd seen in the bank, then the Hendersons. Family farms that had been around for 100 years were being dismantled by a few paragraphs of legal boilerplate. The auctioneer's chant, once the sound of opportunity, became a funeral dirge sung week after week across the county. I survived. I had no debt. My operating costs were my own. I paid for my seed and fertilizer with cash from my savings account. I sold just enough grain to live on, storing the rest in my paid-for bins, waiting for a better price that I knew might not come for years. My life didn't change. I still drove the old Chevy. I still fixed my own machinery. Martha and I didn't take vacations. We ate from our garden and canned the surplus. We lived the way my father had lived during the Depression, not because we were poor, but because we were free. One day, Martha came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me, her eyes clear. "Jed," she said, her voice quiet. "I understand now. Mary Beth Henderson called me this morning. The bank is taking their farm. They have to be out in 30 days. Her new station wagon. It's being repossessed." She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Thank you for the old car," she whispered. "Thank you for the solid roof on our barn." The final notice came in the spring of '84. The Davies farm, the whole 1,000 acres, the new house, the massive machine shed, the gleaming grain bins. All of it was going on the auction block. The king was being deposed. I saw Rich a few days before the sale. He was at the gas station, putting $5 worth of fuel into his dusty Lincoln Continental. He looked like a ghost. He had lost 50 pounds, his eyes were hollow, and his expensive suit was replaced by stained work clothes that hung off his frame. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep, crushing weariness. He saw me, and for a moment I thought he would turn away in shame. But he just gave a slight, defeated nod. "Jed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Rich," I replied. I didn't know what else to say. "I'm sorry," he gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "You were right. You and your old man. You were right all along." He looked down at the greasy gas pump handle in his hand. "Leverage. That's what I called it. The bankers called it that too. You know what it really is? It's a chain, and when you slip, they pull it tight." He finished pumping and screwed the cap on, his movements slow and deliberate. "You going to the sale?" "I thought I might," I said. He nodded again, looking out toward the horizon. "That Panther, the big Steiger, I still owe $120,000 on it. They'll be lucky to get 50 for it. The bank will get the tractor, and I'll still owe them 70 grand. He finally looked at me, his eyes swimming with a pain so profound it was hard to witness. "Don't let them tear up the home place too bad, Jed. My wife, she planted rose bushes by the front porch." He got in his car and drove away, leaving me standing there in the silence. The day of the Davies auction was cold and grey, with a raw wind that whipped across the farmyard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. It felt like a wake. The crowd was thin, mostly bankers in suits and a few out-of-state land speculators looking for a bargain. The local farmers were there, but they stood in small, quiet groups, their hands in their pockets, their faces grim. This wasn't a celebration of success, it was a warning of failure. Rich was there, standing with his wife and 2 young children near the back of the machine shed, looking small and lost against the backdrop of his own ruin. Mr. Harrison, the banker, was at the front, his face a mask of professional detachment, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The auctioneer started with the equipment. The big, new machines that had been symbols of Rich's power now looked like extravagant follies. The Panther III, its red paint still glossy, sold for $52,000, a sickening loss. The massive 24-row planter brought a fraction of its original cost. Piece by piece, the empire was liquidated for pennies on the dollar. I didn't bid. I didn't need any of it. My shed was full of tools that were mine. Then they came to the land. They sold it off in parcels. The Johnson place went first, then the quarter section he'd bought last. The prices were heartbreakingly low. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. "All right, folks, next up we have tract number 4. The original 80-acre home farm, with house, machine shed and bins." This was the heart of it all, the place where Rich's wife had planted her roses. The bidding started, slow and cruel. A speculator from Des Moines opened at $600 an acre. Another man countered at $650. It stalled there. The auctioneer pleaded and cajoled, but no one moved. The bank had a reserve on it, and the price wasn't high enough. I saw Mr. Harrison whisper something to the auctioneer. They were going to pull it, list it with a realtor, and leave the Davies family in limbo for months. I took a deep breath. I thought of Rich's hollow eyes. I thought of my father's words about fair-weather friends. I stepped forward. $1,000 an acre, I said, my voice clear and steady in the cold air. A hush fell over the crowd. Every head turned to look at me. The speculator from Des Moines scowled, shook his head and stepped back. He was out. Mr. Harrison's eyes widened in surprise. "I have $1,000 an acre," the auctioneer shouted, his voice suddenly energized. "Do I hear 1,100? $1,000 once, twice." He looked around the silent crowd. "Sold for $1,000 an acre to Jedediah Stone." I walked to the clerk's table. I didn't have a checkbook with me. I pulled out a passbook from my savings account at a different bank, the one in the next town over, and a deposit slip. I endorsed the $80,000 cashier's check I had prepared that morning, just in case. Paid in full. I found Rich standing by his old Lincoln, his family already inside. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the gravel, his shoulders slumped. "You came to pick the bones after all, Jed," he said, his voice thick with bitterness. "No," I said quietly. "I came to stop the bleeding." I held out a piece of paper. It was a simple rental agreement I had written out myself. "This is a lease, $1 a year, for the house and the 80 acres. You and your family aren't going anywhere." He finally looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What?" You farm it, I said. You use the house. You get back on your feet. The day you walk into my kitchen and hand me $80,000, the place is yours again, not a penny more, no interest. Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He just stood there, a broken man being offered a hand he never expected. Why? He finally managed to choke out. Because the bank was your friend when the sun was shining, I said, echoing the words that had guided my life. A man needs a real neighbor when it starts to rain. The years that followed were quiet ones. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving deep scars on the landscape and the community. Some farmers like me survived, many didn't. The talk at the diner changed. The men who had once pitied me now looked at me with a quiet respect. Young farmers, just starting out, would stop by my workshop. They didn't ask about the newest tractors. They asked how to rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, how to tell when a bearing was about to fail, how to set money aside and stay out of the banker's office. I told them what my father had told me. I showed them my tools, my well-maintained but ancient machinery, my ledgers written in pencil, balanced to the penny. Rich Davies and his family stayed on the home place. He took a job driving a truck for the co-op, working long hours. His wife took a job in town. Slowly, painstakingly, they started to save. They never missed their $1 a year rent payment. One evening, nearly 10 years later, I was in my workshop, greasing the bearings on that old Brillion cultipacker, the one I'd bought at Tom Miller's sale so long ago. My grandson, a boy of 12, was helping me. "Grandpa," he asked, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, "how come we don't have a new tractor, like the ones with the computers and the TVs in the cab?" I stopped turning the grease gun and looked at him. I pointed to the giant faded green Steiger sitting in the corner of the shed. "You see that tractor, son?" I said. "It doesn't have a computer. It has a big engine, strong steel, and simple parts. But its greatest feature is that it's ours. Nobody can take it away from us. It doesn't matter if corn is $2 or $10. That tractor will be right here, ready to work. Freedom isn't about having the shiniest toy. It's about not owing any man a single dime for the tools you need to make a living." Just then, an old Ford pickup I recognized pulled into the lane. Rich Davies got out. He looked older, his hair was grayer, but his back was straight. He walked into the shop, holding a cashier's check in his hand. He didn't say a word, he just handed it to me. I looked at it, then at him. I nodded and handed him the deed to his farm. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Jed," he said. "You taught me the difference between being rich and being wealthy." I just smiled. I looked from the check in my hand to my grandson's curious face, then to the old paid-for machines standing silent in the shadows of my shed. The sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the fields. The land was quiet, peaceful, and it was mine. All of it. And in that moment, I felt a deep, abiding satisfaction that no amount of money could ever buy.